And then I wanted to tell you, I've got this thing. I don't know if you've seen this black mark. You probably thought that I had gotten crazy with the whiteboard marker. But you remember how I told you as you get older, stuff just starts falling apart? I woke up this morning, I looked in the mirror, it was all good. I washed my face and I pulled the washcloth away, and I've got, I guess it's a broken blood vessel. But good news, I don't think it's going to kill me before the end of the semester. Yeah, I know. Sorry, Canada. Okay, so you guys just need to keep hanging in there working. Any questions before we get going? Okay, so last time we talked about the alternatives to mergers. We talked about the strategic alliance and the joint venture. There's one other great joint venture. If you've got a desire to read on your own, you can go look it up. It's GM and Toyota out in California. An amazing story that involves marijuana and the munchies. Okay, now we're moving on to taxable acquisitions. Remember we said earlier that typically if there's cash involved, that could be taxable. Who's going to end up paying the taxes? What kind of taxes are they in an acquisition? Capital gains tax, and who's ended up having to pay them?
It's two taxes, right? There's the corporation,
No, you're thinking about double taxation.
Yeah.
So it's basically just the target shareholder, and they're going to owe capital gains taxes if they're selling their shares for more than they paid for them. Okay, so that's the situation on taxable acquisitions. We see that if you do it with stock, it's typically tax-free. So it's just considering that you're exchanging equity in one business for another. But there are a couple of caveats. Number one, the acquisition has to be for business purposes, not just to evade paying taxes. I'm going to tell you how you can evade paying taxes using mergers and acquisitions. But when you make your announcement about the merger, you don't say, oh yeah, this is a sweet tax dodge, man. That's why we're doing it, right? You're going to have all these other reasons about synergies and economies of scale. Oh, and by the way, there's also a small tax benefit, right? That's not what you'll always hear. You won't ever hear anyone saying, we're doing this purely for the tax benefits. Now, earlier I said, if you exchange equity in one firm for the other, in the target firm for the bidding firm, then that's called continuity of equity interest, and that is the target shareholders, now they've got stock in the new firm. So they go from being equity holders in the target firm to being equity holders in the new firm. Now, if you got paid in stock and you did not want to hold stock in the bidding firm, what could you do?
Sell.
Yeah, you could sell the shares, and then what would you possibly owe? Capital gains tax, right? So you could easily turn one of these tax-free acquisitions into a taxable acquisition if you just sell your shares. Questions? Okay, so now let's talk about accounting for acquisitions. And the way that we're allowed to do now is called the purchase accounting method. And that is where we put the assets of the target firm onto our balance sheet, the bidding firm, at the fair market value of the assets. Now, what does that mean? It means that I've got to go out and figure out what is the fair market value for all these individual assets. Do you think that's easy to do? No. And that's going to be one of the things that's going to cost you a lot of money in doing one of these acquisitions, is figuring this out. Because after all, you're going to have to hire consultants and the like to do this sort of thing. By the way, I'm available for this sort of work starting at around $1,000 an hour, right? So you got to pay a lot of money to get this figured out, and you are probably going to pay more than the sum of the fair market value of the assets when you make an acquisition. If you think about a company like Apple, do you think Apple is worth more than the sum of the fair market value of its individual assets? Yes, Mr. Ingram, why?
Because the synergy of having all of those together under the same umbrella produces value in excess of market value.
I like that. Let's ask a marketing person.
It's brand value.
Yeah, the brand value. Oh my goodness. Apple has such a strong brand. When I was in China, I saw all sorts of fake goods with the Apple logo on it. I'm like, there's the Apple toilet. I didn't even know they made those, right? Well, why are they putting the Apple logo on everything? Because there's brand value. And so when we buy a company, not only are we paying the sum of the fair market value of the assets, but we're also going to be paying for that brand value, the synergies, that sort of stuff. And so we have to figure out where we're going to put that extra money on the books. We went out there and we spent $1 billion for a company, only $400 million in assets. So now I have to figure out what to do with that other $600 million. It gets accounted for as goodwill. Goodwill. Goodwill is that excess amount over and above. And goodwill is an intangible asset. Goodwill is an intangible asset. And we used to have to amortize it on a yearly basis, but then some companies made a good argument. They said, well, wait a minute, the value of that goodwill might not go down. In fact, it might go up. And so they made the argument that instead of amortizing it out over, I think it was 10 years, instead of doing that, why don't we annually check these assets for impairment, this goodwill asset, check it for impairment, and if it's impaired, we'll take a write-down. Now let's talk about how an impairment might happen. Let's say that let's see, do you guys remember Tiger Woods? Mm-hmm. And Tiger Woods was a spokesman, probably still is, for who?
Buick.
Buick? Okay, let's just use Buick. What if Buick, if they had some goodwill related to Tiger Woods, and then, you remember what happened with him and his wife?
Mm-hmm.
And she figured out he was cheating on her. He got in the Escalade and drove off, and I think he hit a tree or a fire plug. And then she rescued the living daylights out of him with a golf club. So that's how I remember the story anyway. By the way, did you know that after that, Tiger Woods wound up in sex addict therapy down in Hattiesburg, Mississippi?
I didn't know it was Hattiesburg.
I didn't know that they had such a place there. I lived there. I'm like, where was that place?
Why would you not?
Yeah, well, obviously it's not. I've got problems, but that's not one of them, right? Anyway, so on with the story. So, if Buick had some goodwill associated with Tiger Woods, at that point they would have to take a write-down. Oh, and one more recent example. Kanye West. Kanye West had these shoes that he was selling through Adidas. What was the brand on them? Yeezy. It's like rhymes with skeezy. Anyway, so then, so Adidas had just a boatload of stuff, and so there's goodwill involved there. They bought that brand from Kanye. And then what does Kanye go and do? He says some mean things about a certain group of people, right? Can you do that and get by with it? No. And so they would have to impair any goodwill related to that. I thought it was funny at the time. They were like, oh, we can't sell these shoes. And they sat on them for a while. And then recently they announced, we'll go ahead and sell those shoes, right? Because they had like $1 billion worth of inventory worth of Kanye's shoes. Okay, so that's the good, we know where the goodwill comes from, and now it has to be inspected annually for impairment. If the thing that is associated with doesn't get tarnished, maybe you don't ever have to impair that goodwill.
Well, how do you go about deciding what the impairment is? It sounds pretty subjective.
It is, and that's why once again...
Obviously, you're going to do it in your favor.
Ooh.
Right.
Okay, so you have to be careful about under diminishing it, because you could end up with some sort of shareholder lawsuit. You could get in trouble with the SEC or the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or you have to be careful about overdoing it, because it could look like earnings manipulation. Let's say that we had a really good quarter, and then we do that. You know, there's two ways you can get in trouble with that. And you say it's subjective, you're absolutely right. But once again, who do you have to hire? You hire an outside third-party consultant. Once again, I'm available starting at $1,000 an hour. Right? I can just see 10 years from now someone watching this and says, $1,000 an hour, isn't that the minimum wage now? Yeah. Thanks, inflation. Okay, so the other way, and this is the way the merger I was involved in, we did pooling of interests. And pooling of interest was a whole lot easier, and that is where you just add the assets from the balance sheets of both together, right? And then it's all good. But apparently that's no longer, it's illegal now. Apparently for some reason people thought that was a bad idea. So all you really need to know about is the purchase accounting method. Questions? Let's talk about the gains from acquisitions. Remember we said there had to be some sort of incremental gain in order to make this possibly a positive NPV project. The goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. And so just like when we're looking at projects like factories and machines and all that, we need to look at these acquisitions from a net present value perspective. And if something's going to have a positive net present value, it either has to A, bring in extra money, or B, save you money that was going to be going out and is no longer going out. And so we're going to talk about where these gains come from. And there are 4 basic categories, and I'm going to go over each one of these in a little more depth. The first one's called revenue enhancement. What's revenue? It's the money coming in, right? And then cost reduction is pretty self-explanatory. Lower taxes, I mentioned that we could lower our taxes. And there's also reduction in capital needs. Capital like buildings, equipment, things like that. So let's talk about revenue enhancement. The first would be marketing gains. And this was actually one of the rationales for the merger between T-Mobile and Sprint. No, Sprint and, it was the one before that when Sprint merged with, I forget who. Well, anyway, they said basically, our advertising is so much more effective than theirs that when we start using our advertising people, we'll get huge gains from that. We'll have cost savings, plus our advertising will be more effective. And so that was their rationale. I personally, it's really hard to nail that down, right? It would be really hard, as you said, subjective, to figure that out. Something that's a little more tangible to me is distribution. So here's an example for you. In Springfield, let's assume that we have a goat farmer. And the goat farmer has a goat dairy. And on the goat dairy, he makes goat milk and goat cheese and goat soap and some other stuff that hippies would be interested in. But so hippies, I'm sorry, so, do you guys know about hippies? Yeah, the organic, crunchy crowd. Okay, so, and by the way, my wife and I enjoy goat cheese too, so I'll include us in that group. Goat cheese is not all that popular. There's a very limited market for it. But this guy's turning out goat cheese left and right. And we know what happens when supply and demand are out of balance. The price on his goat cheese is going to be fairly low. Actually, if it's in balance, the price will be low. And so here's what could happen. We have another company in town here, Kraft. Do you guys know about Kraft? Yeah, so what does Kraft make here in town? Kraft milk or macaroni and cheese is their big thing. Every box of macaroni and cheese sold west of the Mississippi River comes from Springfield, Missouri, and there's a plant in Illinois that serves the east. Anyway, so we've got Kraft here, and they do have some regular cheese operations. What if Kraft were to purchase the goat cheese operation? What could Kraft do with that goat cheese that the local farmer cannot? Yeah, they can market it globally. By the way, goat cheese is popular with people from the Middle East. And so you might see them be able to sell it up in Michigan, where we have a large Arab American population. It's also popular with French people, so maybe they could sell some goat cheese in France. And so it's this distribution network. Now that they're able to distribute this to where there is greater demand, what could they do to the price? Yeah, they could increase it because they're not flooding the local market with all this goat cheese. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's when we talk about marketing gains. Those are the 2 big ones we're talking about. Now let's talk about strategic the benefits, and we say it provides an option for expansion. In Chapter 17, we're going to learn that the option is the right but not the obligation to do something. If you go out there, you might buy a company that gives you the option to do some other things. So my favorite example of this is Procter & Gamble. If you roll back to the 1950s, Procter & Gamble is primarily a soap company. They make lots of soap, and they are the biggest sponsor for these daytime dramas that were on TV, and the advertisements were all for soap, so those became known as soap operas. So there's a little American history for you. Now, Procter & Gamble wants to expand, and they are going to expand to try to serve the same customers they're currently serving, but with a new product. And they decide they want to do toilet paper. You may not realize this, but getting toilet paper right is not easy. So instead of doing their own research, what they did was they went out and they bought a company called Charmin. Charmin made great toilet paper, so Procter & Gamble goes out there and buys them. Now, it's not just toilet paper then that this allows them to do. What else could you do if you had technology that allowed you to make toilet paper? What other products could you make?
Tissues.
Yeah, so like Kleenex facial tissues would be one of them. What else could you make? What looks like toilet paper only is bigger? Paper towels. It's like toilet paper for giants, right? So it's basically the same idea. And then in 1967, I think it was, they took their knowledge in this area of dealing with human nastiness, and they moved into diapers. Pampers came out. You guys probably don't realize it, but there was a time when people actually used cotton cloth diapers on their kids. I was born in 1971. I was the last of my cousins to be a cotton diaper baby. You too? And then the younger people, so if you had a cousin that was born a few years later, probably disposable diapers. Okay, and then there's one other area that they were able to expand into, and that would be feminine hygiene, and we won't go too far into that one. But the idea was that just buying Charmin gave them a foothold that allowed them to expand beyond that. So that's your strategic benefits story. Any questions about strategic benefits? Okay, market power. If you make a horizontal acquisition, then you control more of the market, right? So it's like if Verizon bought T-Mobile, they would control more of the market for mobile phone contracts. What could they then do? Yeah, raise the price. So it's if they had a total monopoly, then they could raise it to the monopoly price level. But we see that there's also duopolies and these other. The fewer players we have, the more pricing power each player has, and that's called market power. Now, another form of market power that we don't think of as often is the power with your suppliers. So, for example, who do you think has power in a relationship, Walmart or their supplier? Yeah, it's almost always Walmart, right? You've got to be a pretty freaking huge supplier to have power compared to Walmart. And so the market power isn't just with your pricing to your customers, it's in how much you can twist the arm of your suppliers to lower their prices or offer you more favorable terms. I remember a while back, I told you about my experience at Walmart. They're not that great about paying on time, but they just came out and said, hey, we want you guys to pay in 60 days, or to require us to pay in 60 days instead of 30. Well, does the supplier have any leverage on Walmart? No, so they basically got to go along with it. And so what happens? Those suppliers turn around to their suppliers and kind of twist their arms too. So this is like a ripple effect. But that's market power from the perspective of purchasing goods. You can demand lower prices from your suppliers. You got to be careful though when you're doing one of these horizontal acquisitions, because you could be accused of anti-competitive behavior by the FTC or Federal Trade Commission, and you could wind up in court. In fact, a lot of these mergers and acquisitions, they do end up in court, and they end up getting settled by the government saying, you need to sell a certain amount of assets to maintain competition. So for example, Mobil and Exxon were two different oil companies. And if you were driving out in West Texas, at almost every exit, where there was a gas station, there was a Mobil and there was an Exxon. And what do you think would happen to the price of gasoline at those stations if those two companies merged and were allowed to keep all their stations? Yeah, it would go up, right? And so the government said, okay, you guys can merge, but here's what you got to do. Everywhere you have these two stations within so many miles of each other, you've got to sell one. And so what Mobil and Exxon did is they figured out which stations were the best, and then they put the rest of them up for sale. And I told you about Valero, the refinery company. They ended up buying those stations. So that is why, just basically overnight, you have all these Valero stations popping up out in Texas and Arkansas, is because those were where Mobil and Exxon were previously competing, but now would not be. Okay, now I will tell you a great story about market power that happened here in Missouri. We have this really crappy airport in Columbia, Missouri. Anybody here from around Columbia? So they got the Columbia Regional Airport, which the acronym is CRAP, which sounds about right because it's the kind of place where you fly out on a plane that's like made for 6 people and you have to hold a chicken on your lap. And the flights are irregular at best. So what does that mean? If you live in Columbia, you typically, oh, for shame, she's late. If you live in Columbia, you typically are going to be flying out of Kansas City or St. Louis, and they're both about 2 hours away. The problem is most of the flights are early in the morning, so that means you have to get up 2 hours before early in the morning, and even more than that because you have to be there, at least an hour before your flight takes off. And so you end up with people out there at dark 30 on I-70 trying to get to Kansas City or St. Louis. And there were a couple of old hippies, guys named Tom and Doc, and they decided they were going to, of course, they were hippies, they have a van, right? And they decide that what they could do, because they're up that time of night anyway, that they can give people rides to the airport. And it was really successful. You could, and what's limiting their pricing? Well, all they have to do is be less than the IRS mileage that your employer would have been paying you to go to the airport and back. All they have to do is beat that. And then they could even go a little higher than that because of the parking at the airport. And so there is this economic situation where they can get in there and make some money. Plus, your employer would rather someone else be driving you at that time of the morning, someone who's used to being up at that hour, rather than you with your sleepy self trying to drive to Kansas City and St. Louis. And so they start out, and let's say they're charging $50 for a round trip. $50 for a round trip. And it's a very profitable business. And after a while, they're like, man, we've got 2 hippies, we could get 2 vans. And so they go out and they buy another van. And so now they're servicing both Kansas City and St. Louis every day. And then they're like, wow, man, we could go buy some more vans and do even more. And before long, they had a whole fleet, and it was called MOEX, was the name of the company. And they were making a lot of money. And they attracted the attention of an out-of-state business consortium who saw how great this business was and asked if they could buy it from Tom and Doc. And they did. But they made a mistake. They did not get a non-compete clause. Oh yeah, so dumb, so dumb. Actually, it was Tiger Express to begin with. And they bought Tiger Express. Now, Tom and Doc are sitting on a pile of money, and the people who bought the business had to go into debt to do it, but the cash flows were so strong that the bank loaned them a bunch of money. But here's what happened. Tom and Doc got bored. Tom and Doc got bored, and they formed their own company called MOEX, and they started competing with their old company. But now they're sitting on a pile of cash, so they go out and they advertise. And they're like, hey, we're back. It's Tom and Doc. Now we've got some new vans. And they are charging $40. What immediately does Tiger Express have to do? They got to immediately drop to $40, right? Now, they're barely making money, Tiger Express now, barely making money because they got this high debt load. But Tom and Doc are sitting on a pile of money. So what can they do? They can drop their price even further to $30. And what does Tiger Express have to do? They have to drop it too, but now they're running at a loss. It doesn't take very long for them to approach Tom and Doc and say, hey guys, would you buy this business back? And Tom and Doc, although they're hippies and probably are high, they still have really good business sense, and they end up buying it back for like 10 cents on the dollar, something like that, just so these guys can get out. And then, what do you think happened the very next day to the price of a round trip ticket? Right back to 50, right? Now, why were Tom and Doc able to get by with that? Because everything was within the state of Missouri. And either the state of Missouri doesn't have anti-monopoly laws, or they don't enforce them. By the way, having law on the books doesn't mean anything if no one enforces it, right? And so Tom and Doc, price comes right back. So there's your example of market power. Questions? Now let's talk about cost reduction. Economies of scale is one of the things you'll hear mentioned frequently with mergers and acquisitions, and there's a lot of truth to it. Think about this. If you are merging two companies together, do you need two company headquarters? No. Do you need two CEOs? No. Do you need two CFOs? No. There is a lot of redundancy that we can eliminate after the merger. By the way, if you're ever at a company that's going to be involved in a merger and the people say, but nothing's going to change, that is a terrible, terrible lie. That is just a straight up lie. In fact, I was sent to tell that lie to a bunch of people at one point, and then 90 days later, I was handing them their final paychecks, right? It's just a lie, and people tell it, and you hope it's true, but it's never true. By the way, if nothing changes, do you think there's any value in the merger? Probably not. There's definitely not economies of scale. And so we're spreading the overhead over more units of production. Now we're spreading that cost of the corporate headquarters over the production of two companies, not just one. We're spreading the cost of the CEO over two companies, not just one. So that's economies of scale. Why do you think it took Amazon so long to become profitable? They had to build up the scale in order to get these economies of scale. And the same was true back when Walmart was getting started. And then we have the economies of vertical integration. It makes it easier to coordinate these operations that are in the same supply chain, same value chain. I'll give you an example. When I was making safety valves at Halliburton, the drilling for my stuff had to go through someone else's operation within the plant. And whose jobs do you think had priority on the drill? His jobs or mine? Do you guys know humans at all? It's his jobs, right? No matter how hot my job was, if he had any work over there at all, his was going to go first. And so what did I do? I went out and I bought an old turret lathe, and I refitted it to be a drill. Now, it wasn't as fast as his, and it cost more to run than his, but it gave me the ability to keep promises to my customers because I could control that step of the process. I would prefer to be able to control each and every step of the process because then I'm not getting left hung out to dry by other people. And so that's economies of vertical integration. And then we have the complementary resources argument. So our favorite example of complementary resources is the patio and fireplace store. Imagine, if you will, on two sides of Glenstone Avenue, over here we've got a patio store where they sell barbecue grills and patio furniture and those big umbrellas. And on the other side, we have the fireplace store where you can buy everything related to the fireplace. In the summertime, the fireplace store owner looks across the street and sees all the customers buying the patio furniture and looks in her own store and cries because no one is buying fireplace stuff in July. However, come December, it's the fireplace, or it's the patio store owners looking across the street at the fireplace store with envy because everyone is over there buying fireplace stuff. Now, what if those two companies could get together? What could they do? Well, they could consolidate their operations into one building and sell off the other building. And when the business was good for the patios supplies, it would be bad for the fireplace supplies and vice versa. But the cash flows would level out. And they would be able to also have economies of scale there. They're spreading their cost of the building over more sales. Let's discuss another couple of examples of this. When I lived in Lafayette, or New Iberia, Louisiana, they had an arena in Lafayette, which is just the town up the highway. And in that arena, they had an ice rink. And they had a local hockey team called the Ice Gators. You remember the Ice Gators? Which sounds like ice skaters if you say it really fast. So the Ice Gators. Now, my friends were Cajuns. They knew nothing about hockey, but they did enjoy going to the games because they had a big slingshot and they would shoot hot dogs up into the crowd. That was like the big thing.
I like to fight.
What's that?
I like to fight.
Yeah, Cajuns can understand fights just like any other human, right? Okay, so it's like going to see boxing, only you don't have to pay as much. On with the story. Do you think that the hockey season alone is enough to keep an arena like that in business? No. And so they had also an arena football team. Arena football, for those of you who are not familiar, is like a smaller version of the NFL. The field's shorter. It's all played inside of an arena. And as you might guess, the cheerleaders are slightly less attractive too. I knew one of them, lovely person, but she definitely was not NFL quality cheerleader. So that was something that they could both do in that arena that would take advantage of it. Here on our campus, we have the Great Southern Bank Arena, and not only do we have men's basketball, the primary purpose, what else goes on there? Concerts. We had Carrie Underwear, or Carrie, whatever her name is. She came, and then we had the Eagles. They opened the place up. And then, in addition to concerts, what else do we have? Yeah, the Pro Bowl riding, whatever. They actually bring in truckloads of dirt and put it on. It's amazing, right? That's a complementary resources store where we're all able to use this more efficiently than if we were just using it for men's basketball. And I'll give you one final example because it will most likely be on the exam. Are you ready for an example that most likely will be on the exam? Yes. Oh, very good. Okay, now let's think about skiing. Skiing, there is a ski lodge down here at the bottom, and that's where you stay when you go to ski. Ski lodges are almost invariably located at the bottom of some sort of hill, right? Because this is where people do their skiing. You can tell why I'm not an artist. Okay, so this is where people do their skiing. When is the ski lodge full? In the wintertime. In the summertime, what do you think happens at the ski lodge? Whole lot of nothing. So, what could we do that would allow us to utilize this lodge more of the time?
Weddings.
What's that?
Do like weddings there.
Okay, I like that idea. You could do weddings.
Zip lines.
What's that?
Zip lines.
You could do zip lines because you've got this hill, right? You have to have some way to break them on the other end. I guess all of the zip lines have to have that. By the way, you couldn't get me on a zip line. There's no amount of money. Okay, back to the story. What else? By the way, we've got some flat land over here. What could we do? How about a golf course? We could have a golf course over here, and we could have golfing when the weather is good for golfing, and we could have skiing when the weather's good for skiing, and we can keep our lodge full more of the months of the year. So that's another great complementary resources story. Questions? Okay, we could lower our taxes. What if I find a company that is consistently not profitable? It'll have something called tax loss carry forwards. And what I can do is buy that company, and I can use those tax loss carry forwards to offset my own profitable operations to reduce my taxes. Now, why would I buy a company that was consistently running at a loss? Number one, it might just be poor management, right? It could be a good business model, just poor management. Number two, maybe that business just doesn't have the scale. Recently, Come and Go. You guys know Come and Go? Great place to get shot in Springfield at night. Come and Go was bought out by another company called Maverick. And one of the rationales was that Come and Go just couldn't achieve the economies of scale that it needed to achieve the kind of profitability that it should have. And so Maverick's able to buy them. Let's assume that Come and Go had a bunch of losses. They would have these tax loss carry forwards. Maverick could use them to write down their now profitable operations to the point where they were saving on their taxes. Number two would be the use of unused debt capacity. We've talked about in here previously that for a given industry, there's typically a given capital structure. So for banks, they're using 90% debt. For electric utilities, they're using 50% debt, and so on. If you buy a target that is under-levered, meaning that they are not at their optimal level of debt, what you can do is use that unused debt capacity. You could take on more debt, and then that would reduce your taxes because you're able to write the interest off. Because remember, debt has that tax shield. So that would be another way we could lower our taxes. The way to wrap your head around this is to think about two people getting married. One of them, let's say they both have $30,000 in credit card capacity, right? And one of them pays off their bill every month. So they have an additional $30,000 that they could spend. And the other one has maxed out their credit cards. We'll call him Kevin. That's my cousin who did exactly this thing. He married a woman who was very responsible with her credit cards and had lots of unused debt capacity. What do you think Kevin did immediately after that? He ran up debt. Yeah, he's just a kid, right? He runs up the debt on her credit card too. Now, in that case, there's no tax benefit because credit card interest is not tax deductible. But if it were a company, then that additional interest would be used to reduce their taxes. Then we have the argument about the use of surplus funds, and I hate the word surplus. Let's talk about what surplus funds are. If you have already made all of your positive net present value investments and you still have money left over, then that can be considered surplus funds. But who does the money belong to? The shareholders. So what we would tell you is they should either pay dividends, but they'd say, well, wait a minute, that might incur taxes on the part of the shareholder. And I say, fine, then just do a share buyback. Then people who don't want to pay taxes right now will just hold their shares. Those who don't mind paying taxes now will go ahead and tender their shares in this buyback offer. But you'll hear managers, instead of doing that, they'll say, we got this extra money. It might actually be better for us to go out and buy this firm. It's better for the shareholders if we go out and buy this firm. That might be a slightly negative NPV project because of these tax concerns. This is a bogus argument. I don't want to ever hear any of you as CEO making this argument. The money belongs to the shareholders. If you can't use it in a positive NPV project, you should return it to them. If it's a one-time surplus of funds, you should do a share repurchase. If it's a surplus of funds that's going to happen over and over again, you might consider raising your dividend. And then finally, we have the ability to write up depreciable assets. Remember, I told you that under the purchase accounting method, that the assets get put onto our books at their fair market value. When I was a supervisor, I had a lot of machines that had a book value of 0. Therefore, I was not getting any more depreciation out of them. However, if someone were to come in and buy those machines, the lowest value machine that I had was worth $50,000, and my highest value machine was worth around $300,000. And so they could buy those, put them on their books at their fair market value, and depreciate them all over again. There is no reason that you can't depreciate the same asset over and over and over again, as long as you're going through these kinds of acquisitions. Now, what does it do? What does it do to our taxes if we can depreciate these assets all over again? Yeah, it reduces your taxes. That's why finance people like depreciation. It allows us to reduce our taxes. Otherwise, it's useless to us because it doesn't represent cash.
So how do you buy your own asset for yourself?
You don't. So I'm going to buy a company, and that company has fully depreciated assets. And when I buy that company, then I'm going to put their assets on my books at the fair market value, and I'm going to depreciate them down all over again. Now, there were 2 real estate companies in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and what they would do is that one of them would fully depreciate an apartment complex, and then they would sell it to the other one, and then they would fully depreciate it, and then they sell it back, right? And so these apartment complexes would go back and forth between these 2 companies. By the way, what do you think these 2 companies had in common? Same owner? Yeah, actually it was a couple of brothers, right? They're selling these back and forth. So that's how you do that. Questions? Now the thing has to be, because when I sell an asset that's depreciated to 0, I have to pay, I'm going to maybe have to pay capital gains tax on, right, when I buy the apartment complex, and then if I sell it, I'm going to have to pay capital gains tax. So the capital gains tax rate needs to be lower than the corporate income tax rate for this to all make sense. Let's talk about reduction in capital needs. We've already touched on this a bit with the patio and the fireplace store. If the target has underutilized assets and the bidder needs more capacity, then the companies together require less capital than the sum of the 2 firms. So let's use examples here. And you can, we'll change the word Chrysler here. What's the name of Stellantis? It's Stellantis. By the way, Stellantis was formed from the mergers of several different companies that all make crap. And so you've got, and you may not realize this, Maserati is crap, right? You got Maserati, you've got Peugeot, you've got some other brands in there, none of them are really great. As a result, Stellantis has lots of spare capacity at their factories because people aren't just rushing out to snap these cars up. What about Hyundai? Hyundai makes a reasonably priced car that's decent quality, that is in demand. And so at least at one point in history, Hyundai, the only thing that was keeping them from selling additional cars was lack of capacity. All of their factories were operating at 100%. So what Hyundai could do would be to go out and buy Stellantis and then use that excess production capacity at the Stellantis factories in order to be able to produce more Hyundais. Now you got to be careful there though, because people will figure out what factory the car came from and they'll kind of refuse to buy the ones that were made at the Stellantis factory. Maybe a better example would be toothpaste. What if you had a crappy competitor and you could buy their underutilized company with the underutilized factories, make a toothpaste there? Does anyone try to track down what factory their toothpaste came from? Only psychopaths, right? And you don't want them as customers anyway. So that would be our reduction in capital needs story. Instead of building a new factory, maybe we go buy someone else's underutilized factory. Let's talk about avoiding mistakes. First of all, do not ignore market value. If the market says a firm is worth $20 per share, does it really make sense for us to think that the firm is worth $24 per share? Standalone value? No. And so your very best guess of the correct valuation for the target company is the current market price. If you think that the market is just vastly undervaluing the target, you are probably wrong, and you're definitely arrogant, right? Because what you're saying is, not only am I smarter than some people, I'm smarter than all the people, right? Would seldom be the case. If it was, it would just be by chance that this thing was overvalued, and then there are other companies that by chance would be undervalued. But on average, the market value is what we think the firm is worth by itself. Now, the next thing is to estimate only incremental cash flows. Remember, I told you about people buying another firm and then saying, oh, it's going to increase our EPS. Well, yes, if you add additional net income with the same number of shares, it will increase your EPS, but it's not incremental. What we're trying to look for are things like the revenue enhancements, the economies of scale, those incremental changes that occur as a result of the merger. And then we need to use the correct discount rate. So just like any other net present value project, we need to think about what is the correct discount rate for this purchase. I'll give you an example that I worked on at Halliburton. At the time, Halliburton was using a single cost of capital across all projects of 11.9%. And so when we went out to do a merger with this really high-tech Scottish firm, we used our 11.9%. And when I was actually involved in this merger, I got to talk to these guys. And I said, well, what is it that your company does? And they said, well, we make these things that go down in the oil well. And it has electronic sensors. And it helps us to determine the amount of natural gas, oil, and salt water that the well produces. By the way, almost every oil and gas well produces those three things. You guys didn't know about the salt water, I'll bet. The problem with the salt water is you can't just pump it out on the ground. It's an environmental hazard. So it has to be then collected and re-injected somewhere else. And so the more salt water you produce, the less profitable the well is. Well, what these crafty Scotsmen had come up with was a valve that could be adjusted to kind of minimize that production of salt water. And here's the cool thing. It would send these signals up to a satellite. The satellite would beam the information down to the control center in Houston. The control center in Houston would make the appropriate adjustments. It would go back into the satellite, and then it would actuate the valve. Now, keep in mind that we've got new technology here. We've got geeks involved. We've got satellites involved. Do you think this might have been more risky than the typical thing we were doing at Halliburton? It absolutely was. So just out of curiosity, I asked one of the Scotsmen what kind of discount rate they would use on projects at their own firm. And he says, 25%. He says, this is some risky shit, right? What discount rate should we have used for that merger? We should have used 25%. Because the thing that we were buying was risky. So, you always want to use the discount rate associated with the target. You always want to use the discount rate associated with the target. Too often, bidders use their own discount rate. Too often, bidders use their own discount rate. So you always want to use the discount rate that's associated with the target, because that's the nature of the assets that you're buying, right? That's the risk of the assets you're buying. And then finally, you need to be aware of transactions costs. So what kinds of transactions costs do we go through with mergers? Well, first of all, you're going to have your lawyers, you're going to have investment bankers, and you're also going to have to disclose some stuff. In order to get these things approved, a lot of times we have to disclose stuff. And you might think that's not a big deal. But what if some of the stuff that you disclosed would be useful to your competitors? Then you might be at a disadvantage. This is, I think, one of the reasons that you see Apple do very few of these things is because they really don't want to disclose all that much about the projects they have ongoing at the firm. What else? When you put these firms together, undoubtedly they're going to have two different information technology setups. Do you think it's cheap and easy to merge those? No. Do you think it's cheap and easy to transition a firm from one system to another? Those of you who are unfortunate enough to not be graduating are going to have to deal with something called bright space. Do you know what I'm having to do right now? I'm having to rebuild all of my classes that are on Blackboard for Brightspace. That's a transaction cost from moving from one platform to the other, and of course, when you merge two companies that are on the same system, you're going to end up with those kinds of costs. Managers always assume it's easy because they've never tried to do it themselves. You'll see this, and Mr. Nylon probably has seen this before, where people that if they don't understand what it takes to accomplish something, they assume that it's easy. And who are they going to make responsible for accomplishing it? You, right? Okay. Once in a while, you'll hear replacing inefficient managers as a rationale for an acquisition, but it's rarely as simple as it sounds. It's rarely true. I'll give you an example. When I worked for Halliburton, we were buying a company called Dresser. And I was being sent down to their factory in Duncanville, Texas, and my orders were to get them on the Halliburton system and doing business the Halliburton way. Because after all, we're brilliant and they're morons. Now they didn't say that exactly that way, but they did. I think the words dark ages came out somewhere in the conversation. Now here's the interesting thing. I go down to the plant in Duncanville and I'm walking around and I'm looking at their systems and I'm looking at their processes and I think, wow, they're actually doing some things better than us. And most things they were doing just as well. There was some arrogance, there was some hubris there, thinking that we were going to sweep in there and that we could instantly just pick up piles of money because we were just such better managers than they were. It just wasn't true. Questions? Okay, we've already talked about this. Now let's talk about defensive actions. We talked about managers and directors don't want to be taken over. Why? Yeah, they'll probably get fired. And so they've got these tools, and we're going to talk about these tools, and they can use them to defend against a takeover. You might say, well, wait a minute. Someone is out here making an offer that is above the current share price. It's obviously maximizing shareholder wealth. If they are trying to prevent the takeover, that's obviously against the goal of financial management. And a lot of times we see that that is the case. But it could be that they are trying to get a higher offer out of the bidding firm. And if they are using the defensive actions in that way, then they are following the goal of financial management. The trick is we really don't know which they're doing, right? They're always going to say that they're trying to maximize shareholder wealth, but they may just be trying to prevent getting taken over. So, example, if you roll back to a few years back, you've got Yahoo. And Yahoo, ever since Google came out, what do you think's happened to Yahoo? Any of you actually Yahoo search stuff? Not anymore. And you remember back when, let's say 1999, if you were going to search for something, who did you?
That was the way to go.
Yeah, Yahoo was the thing, right? Okay. And so what's going on there is Yahoo is struggling, the share price is going down, and you enter the picture is Microsoft. Microsoft, by the way, is sitting on huge piles of cash, too much cash. And that money is burning a hole in the pockets of the Microsoft managers. And so, being arrogant, they decide that they can go out and buy Yahoo and they can turn it around, right? These are the same people that brought you Bing, by the way. They think they can go out and turn Yahoo around. So they make an offer. Let's say Yahoo was trading at $20 a share at the time. They go out and they offer $24 a share. And Yahoo, which by the way, had a chairman of the board, I think he was at the time, was one of the founders, a guy named Andrew Yang, or Yang if you're Chinese. And he said no. Now at this point, we don't know if he's just trying to solicit a higher bid and maximize shareholder wealth, or if he's just trying to keep his phony baloney job. So we have to wait and see what happens next. What happens next is Microsoft raises their bid to 26. So now Andrew looks like a hero to his shareholders, right? But Andrew says, no! Microsoft makes one more offer. And they say, okay, we're offering 28, but that is our final offer. If Andrew had accepted that offer, he would have been a hero to his shareholders. Instead, what does he do? He stamps his feet like a child and says, no! What do you think? Oh, by the way, then Microsoft says, you know what? Forget you, right? Moves on. What do you think happens to the share price of Yahoo the very next day? Yeah, so through this whole thing, the share price of Yahoo has been going up every time that Microsoft raised its offer. But then, as soon as Jerry makes it clear, not Andrew, Jerry, as soon as Jerry makes it clear that he's not going to sell, the stock price drops back. Do you think it just drops back to the 20? No, it dropped down to like 17 because Yahoo had previously had a premium associated with it where people were assuming someone was going to buy it out. But now they've made it clear that's not going to happen. And so all that extra value evaporated. And so basically, not only did he forego the extra value that the offer gave, he also destroyed additional value. Questions? What if he had sold out at the top? He would have been like the greatest CEO ever for those shareholders. Now, let's talk about the different defensive actions. The first would be the corporate charter. When you're going to incorporate a company, you can write the corporate charter however you want. But it's kind of like with bonds. You're going to put the prospectus out there, you're going to put the indenture out there, and people are only going to buy, or they're going to price based on what's in it. So you can create a corporate charter, and you can include some things that would make takeovers more difficult. So first of all, there's the super majority vote. If we have, you could put in there that you have to have 2/3 or more shares voting in favor of of being acquired, then that makes it more difficult for the firm to be bought. And then you could end up with something called classified boards. So let's think back to what's called a straight board. If I have straight board, then what I have is all the directors stand for election every year. And so what does that mean? It means that with one shareholder meeting, we can totally overthrow the current board and put a new board in. But, and by the way, that's how the United States House of Representatives works, right? Every one of those people is up for re-election every 2 years. If we got tired enough of the clowns that are in there now, within a 2-year period, we could replace 100% of those clowns with entirely new clowns, right? We could do that. Is that the case with the United States Senate? No. How long is the senator's term? 6 years. But how often do we have elections for senators? Every 2 years. Every 2 years. And here's why. Only 1/3 of the Senate gets replaced at any given time. And so the Senate in that way is like a classified board. With a classified board, maybe you've got 12 people on it, but only 3 are standing for election in any given year. And so it might take you 3 election cycles to be able to get a majority on that board. That makes it harder to take over the firm. Questions? Now let's talk about something called repurchase and standstill agreements. Actually, the standstill comes first and the repurchase follows. So a standstill agreement is where a bidder, someone who's actively trying to take over a company, agrees to limit their holdings in the target, and it usually marks the end of the takeover attempt. Now, why in the world would they stop? The answer is that the bid or the target firm offers them a targeted repurchase. So they've been building up this stock. Let's say they've been buying the stock at between $5 and $10 a share, and now they've come out that they're trying to take over the firm. By the way, after you own 5%, you have to report. A, you have to report your holding, and B, you have to report your intention. What is it that we plan to do with this? And so what do? You go up to 4.99999%. And by the way, you're doing this all secretively, right? Why would you do it secretively? What's going to happen to the share price if people figure out you're trying to buy the firm? It's going to go up, and so I'm going to have to pay more for the acquisition. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to be secret. I'm going to build up slowly to this 4.999%, and then I'm going to just buy as many shares as I possibly can on one day, and at the end of that day, I'm going to report my position to the SEC. Now, at that point, the target firm, their board may get together and come back and offer me, they say, we know you've been paying between $5 and $10 for your shares. We're going to offer you $15 for every one of your shares in exchange for you agreeing to leave us alone for another 10 years. By the way, why 10 years? Because all the directors and executives are within 10 years of retirement, right? People are scumbags. Okay, so assume that the bidder agrees to this. Where's the money going to come from to pay them this extra amount per share? Whose money is it? The shareholders. And so who actually loses here? The other shareholders, because their money is being used to put an end to an acquisition attempt that would actually bring them additional value. Scumbaggery. Scumbaggery. They're not living out the goal of financial management. They're just protecting themselves, and they're using the company, the shareholders' money to do it. There was actually an example. I went to business MBA at Kent State University, which is right next to Akron, which is like the rubber capital of the world. And one of the big companies in Akron was Goodyear. And a few years before I went there, this British guy, had tried to take over Goodyear. And they had done some really scumbaggy things, Goodyear did, to avoid being taken over. They did one of these targeted repurchases, but the fun thing was, when they figured out he was trying to buy the shares, they went and made an appeal to the public. They said, ladies and gentlemen of Akron, we must preserve Goodyear as a local employer. We must maintain local control. Please go out and buy up all the Goodyear shares that you can to keep them out of the hands of this evil Englishman. So, and there were local drives at the elementary schools. The kids were given their milk money to buy up Goodyear shares to keep them out of the hands of that evil Englishman. What do you think was going on with the managers at the same time? What were they doing with their shares? Selling. Isn't that sick? That is totally sick. Why were they selling? Well, hey, share value hasn't been this high in years, right? So they're unloading. We saw the same thing happen at Enron. The leadership was telling the employees, oh, buy the stock, at the same time that they're dumping their stock. People are scumbags. Okay, so what happened? Eventually, they came to an agreement with this guy, and they basically had to take on a lot of debt in order to be able to basically bribe this person to go away. By the way, we call this green mail. Green mail when we do this targeted repurchase. Green because that's the color of the United States currency-ish, and we're using it to pay these people to go away. So they had to take on a lot of debt. Now here's the fun thing. Goodyear had turned themselves into a conglomerate. And we've discussed before how conglomerates destroy value. Let me tell you about what kind of crazy crap they were into. During World War II, the United States Navy asked Goodyear to build the Corsair fighter. Now, the Corsair was already being built by Chance Vaught, but Goodyear, they couldn't make enough of them, so Goodyear tooled up to make Corsairs, and they made some really good Corsairs. When the war's over, the Navy says, we don't need any more Corsairs, and so Goodyear says, well, what are we going to do with all this airplane crap? So they started Goodyear Aerospace. Now, what's Goodyear's core business? Tires. Goodyear's really good at tires. Do you think that they were as good at aerospace as? No. But then they decided, oh, well, not only will we do airplanes and airplane parts, we can start making satellites too. Now, what do satellites have to do with tires? I have never seen a tire on a satellite, right? And then they actually buy an athletic shoe manufacturing company. Because after all, athletic shoes have rubber soles and they're basically just tires for your feet, right? Why were they doing all this? Remember back to chapter 1, we've got empire building, and that the bigger the company is, the more important you are. And, by the way, if they don't make these crummy acquisitions, what do they have to do with the money? Should be giving it back to the shareholders. And so the managers made some really bad decisions. This is actually what put Goodyear in the position to be taken over. And so now that Goodyear has taken on this huge debt to pay this evil Englishman to go away, now they have to figure out how they're going to pay that debt off. And so what do? They sell all these extraneous businesses to pay down that debt. So in the end, his takeover effort did reform Goodyear. But the person that got the most money out of it wasn't the shareholders, it was the evil Englishman. Questions? Are people scumbags? Yes. Now let's talk about poison pills and share rights plans. So a poison pill, the idea is it's a financial maneuver that makes the target no longer attractive. So what I could say is, if you try to take over my company, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take on a boatload of debt, and I'm going to immediately pay out all that cash as a dividend to my current shareholders, and what you'll be left with is a horribly indebted target firm. By the way, what do you think is more attractive, a firm that has lots and lots of cash or one that's deep in debt? Yeah, lots and lots of cash. And the same thing, if you want to put this in mind, you can think of who would I rather marry? Someone who is deeply in debt or someone who has lots of cash? Cash. We all know the answer to that, right? Okay, so you can make yourself unattractive. That's the idea of the poison pill, is I'm going to make myself so unattractive that it would be poison for them to try to swallow my company. And then I could do what's called a share rights plan. And that is where I could offer to sell stock at a discount to shareholders who'd been with me or with the company for more than 1 year. Because undoubtedly this person that's trying to acquire your firm, they've bought all of their shares within the last few months. If I offer everyone who's had the shares for more than a year the opportunity to buy another share for every share they own for 1 cent, right? Basically, I am doubling the number of shares that the bidder doesn't control. And so they might have thought that they had 5% of the shares, but in truth now they've only got 2.5%, because there are all these new cheap shares that the 1 year and beyond shareholders were able to buy. And so basically it dilutes the holding of the acquiring firm. Now, both of these things are threats. They are threats that the target firm can make, and basically the idea is to force the bidder to the negotiation table, at which point maybe we can reach a deal that I feel gives my shareholders fair value for their shares, and at that point then the target can withdraw the poison pill and the share rights plan and go ahead and let the sale go through. Questions? Okay, now finally we have going private or leveraged buyouts. We've talked about these earlier as a form of acquisition, but they can also be a defense against a takeover. You can actually go out and buy the shares and keep from getting taken over. It is a takeover from the target shareholder's perspective because they're selling their shares. But from the target manager's perspective, it can prevent a takeover. By the way, remember we gave you the example of RJR and Nabisco and how basically they had to reform the business after one of these going private transactions? It can bring value just the same as any of these other defenses. Let's talk about divestitures and restructuring. A divestiture is when the firm sells assets. So if you think about the example from earlier, the gas stations, Mobil and Exxon, they divested those assets in order to meet the legal requirements to get out of trouble with the Federal Trade Commission. Also, a lot of times you take on debt to do a deal. When I was at Halliburton, when we bought Dresser, there were some assets we didn't want. And so we put those together, packaged them together, and sold them to private equity, and then used that money to pay down the debt that we took on to do the deal. And then also, you can actually do 2 and 3 at the same time, and that is getting rid of unwanted assets. By the way, if you're being smart about your business and you go out and buy a conglomerate, without a doubt, there are going to be some of the assets that you get that you really don't want. So what do? You can go ahead and divest those assets and use that money to pay down the debt from the deal. So let's talk about the different kinds of divestitures. In an equity carve-out, the parent is basically going to put all those undesirable assets into a separate company that's completely owned by the parent, and then sell a fraction to the public in an IPO. And so I told you about at Halliburton, we put that stuff into a separate company and then we sold it to private equity. We could have just as easily done this equity carve-out idea. Why in the world do you do an IPO for just a fraction of the assets? We're trying to figure out what those assets are worth. By the way, earlier you mentioned about the asset valuation being subjective. The only way that we can find out the true market value of the assets is to actually put them up for sale, right? And that's what the IPO does. We can say, well, we were able to raise $1 million through the IPO for 5% of the shares. That means this overall thing must be worth $20 billion. We could also do a spinoff. We could take those shares and give them to our current shareholders on a pro rata basis. So if I own 10% in the shares of the big company, then I would also own 10% of the shares in the spinoff. My dissertation chair owned shares in, I forget what company it was, but they actually spun off some of the assets, and he wasn't interested in owning that, so he immediately went and sold those shares. So you might be getting shares that you're not interested in. And then there's the split up. Split ups are fairly rare, and they're usually done for regulatory reasons. So if we go back to the year 1984, AT&T was basically the only phone company in the US, and the courts decided that they had to be broken apart. Back then, phone calls were very expensive on a per minute basis, and now they are next to nothing. You can thank this action back in 1984 that broke AT&T into many different companies for part of that. Who are they talking about breaking apart now? Microsoft, Google, Amazon. So you've got all of these companies now that have built up these monopolies, and the government is talking about crushing them. So Facebook, for instance. Facebook has gone around and they bought up WhatsApp and they bought up Instagram and some other things. And so the argument would be maybe we need to bust those apart to create additional competition for the benefit of consumers. And that is all of chapter 21. So next time, what are we starting on? Chapter 17. I'll see you then. If you like today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share.